From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Chung, and this matters. Many businesses are eyeing or have already started a return to physical workplaces and offices. Mandatory vaccinations are being talked about for employees. If you're heading back to work, can your employer make you get vaccinated? A COVID vaccine mandate isn't hypothetical anymore. The Canadian federal government has one for its employees. Ontario's government is ordering them for workers in high-risk settings. And that filters down to private businesses too. If you work for one of Canada's 5 big banks or Air Canada, they're ordering you to get vaccinated if you want to return to work. But is it legal? What rights does an employer have in this case versus what an employee wants, especially if that employee refuses? Can your employer fire you because of it? While laws are written in black and white, how they get interpreted in the real world can be a little fuzzier. To help make sense of the law and to answer your burning questions, we're joined by Lior Samfiru, employment lawyer and co-founding partner of Samfiru Tumarkin LLP in Toronto. We'll sort through all the legalese of vaccine mandates in the workplace and the legal battles that might come down the line. Thanks so much for joining the podcast, Lior. We appreciate your time.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
So some of the questions I'll throw your way are hypothetical, but for many people who work for a private business or a company, a vaccine mandate is no longer abstract. It's already happening. Canada's biggest banks require vaccines for a return to office of their employees. Many other employers are at least considering it. So let's begin there. When it comes to private business, what legal right do employers have in ordering a vaccine mandate for their employees?
Well, you're absolutely right that this idea of mandatory vaccine policies has been so widespread that it's easy to believe and assume that it must be legal. If everyone's doing it, companies large and small all over the province, all over the country are doing it, one would assume that it's legal, but not so fast. The reality is that for most private businesses, in the absence of a government mandate that requires them to have employees vaccinated, to impose that mandatory vaccine may well be discriminatory, may well be a breach of the human rights legislation in the location in the province where that business operates. So because of that, these employers, large and small, may actually be doing something that's illegal by imposing mandatory vaccines. Now, the reality here is this, that if you're working for one of those employers, that does not necessarily mean that you can physically stop your employer from imposing a policy like that just because that policy is otherwise illegal. There simply are going to be legal consequences for an employer that chooses to do that. But for many employees, that's not necessarily going to be helpful because their job is literally in jeopardy right now.
Right. So what kind of legal challenge or hurdles could you see a business having to clear in order to have its employees be vaccinated before returning to work? What sort of duty or obligation does that employer have?
Under human rights laws, we cannot discriminate against someone based on a disability. So, for example, if you have a cold, that's not a disability. You can, quote unquote, be discriminated because of that. But with COVID-19 being such a serious illness that has killed millions and millions of people across the world and shut down entire economies, having COVID is considered a disability under human rights laws. So what an employer cannot do is treat people that it believes has COVID or may be more susceptible to COVID than other employees. So a mandatory vaccine policy essentially says, we think you unvaccinated employees are more likely to get COVID. It's a perceived or presumed disability. That is discriminatory. So regardless of the reasons why someone may choose not to be vaccinated, even if there isn't a health reason why they don't, that policy, the mandatory vaccine policy, may well be considered discrimination under human rights legislation. So for an employer that imposes that policy, they're going to be susceptible to a challenge under human rights law saying that this policy is illegal. And because of that, if you did fire someone in reliance on a policy like that, you could owe them damages. You could potentially even be ordered to reinstate that employee with back pay. So I don't know that a lot of employers have actually thought about that and understand that this policy may expose them to damages.
I also understand, many workplaces have some form of health and safety protocols. Of course, the wording of that will change depending on what workplace you're in and what that relationship is like between employee and employer. But is that possible that they could fold these vaccine mandates under that umbrella of existing rules to say, listen, a mandate is for the health and safety of everybody? Could they potentially use something like that?
So let's be very clear. When an employer imposes mandatory vaccines, they're not doing that to try to hurt someone. They're certainly doing that for all the right reasons, to protect employees, to protect the public, for the sake of health and safety. That's clear. But the reality is this. Our governments, certainly here in Ontario, have at this moment, said that a workplace is considered safe as long as masking takes place, social distancing takes place. It's because of that the governments have not, at least the Ontario government, has not imposed mandatory vaccines. So if the government says your workplace employer is safe even without a vaccine, for the employer to then say, well, I disagree. I still think my workplace is not safe without a vaccine, that is problematic. Because at the end of the day, the government sets requirements for safety in the workplace. And if the government says your workplace is safe without a vaccine, I think it's going to be very difficult and challenging for an employer to say, no, that's simply not the case.
Right. An employee of a business can refuse to be vaccinated if they're under this mandate. But the question so many people, especially in the next few weeks, will be asking is, can they be fired if they go against company policy of not being vaccinated? I know that it's a different country, different laws, but we have seen that play out with CNN employees in the US where there were 3 unvaccinated employees and they were let go. Can that be something that happens? You spoke about, again, it could be under discrimination.
Correct. So the real question is not even can they be fired? The question is, can they be fired legally? Because in terms of can they be fired? Sure, absolutely. An employer can always let an employee go. There's no way to physically prevent an employer from letting an employee go. The real question is it legal? By firing someone, are they in breach of any laws? And arguably the answer is yes. An employer that fires an employee who refuses to vaccinate, that employer may be in breach of human rights legislation. If there's no severance pay, that employer could have wrongfully dismissed the employee, so in breach of employment laws as relates to wrongful dismissal. So that employee that has been let go because they've been wrongfully dismissed or arguably have been discriminated against may be owed certain amounts of damages. And if you take an employer that does this times however many employees, that exposure to that employer could be significant. Severance alone could be as much as 2 years' pay, depending on a number of factors. So you may have an employer that says, I'm going to let these 10 people go because they haven't been vaccinated. That exposure that the employer has could easily be into the hundreds of thousands of dollars to those employees or more, but you can potentially still lose your job. So employees ultimately will have to decide what is best for me. Am I better continuing to work even if it means getting vaccinated? Or am I better off not getting vaccinated, losing my job, if that's what my employer is going to do, and then deal with any damages that I'm owed as a result? And that's certainly not going to be an easy question for employees to decide between.
We'll be right back. So to be clear, an employee can be fired, but the likelihood that an employer has to, at the very least, pay out their severance, that's likely how it would have to play out.
An employer will absolutely have to pay out those employees their severance. That's for certain. The thing that is up in the air is, will they have to also pay additional human rights type damages? And I think that there's certainly a strong case for that, but severance will absolutely have to be paid. Now, the only time an employer may not have to pay severance is if it's not the employer deciding to impose mandatory vaccines, if all the employer is doing is following a government mandate. So if the government says, employer, we're going to make the decision for you. We're going to decide that you have to have your employees vaccinated or you can't have employees, then at that point, an employer that follows a government mandate will not have to pay these damages because it's not their decision. That decision has been taken away from them.
What about employees who are unionized? Does that play a factor in how complicated this could play out?
Well, the law is the same in terms of the rights of these employees. The thing that is very different is that a unionized employee cannot enforce their own rights. They have to have the union enforce their rights. It's not the employee that has the rights, it's really the union. Therefore, if the union, right or wrong, says we support the employer's decision to impose mandatory vaccines, and we've heard some unions say that, that employee, even though they may still have their rights violated, doesn't have much recourse. So for many employees, you're talking employees working for the city, in the public sector, most of those are unionized. If the union says, no, that's not appropriate to have mandatory vaccine, the union can pursue that by way of grievance and other matters. But if the union supports it, those employees are out of option. Now, for non-union employees, of course, they can choose themselves without relying on anyone else to pursue their rights. So it is going to be a very interesting thing for us to see what unions are going to say about these mandatory vaccines, and are they going to, quote unquote, fight for their workers.
Lior, but what about federal government employees? We've seen that the federal government is ordering a vaccine mandate for those employees. Is there a separate class to how employment laws apply to them?
So let's touch on both provincially regulated employees and federally regulated employees. So first of all, in terms of the government of Ontario, we've heard the government of Ontario talking about mandatory vaccine policies. That said, the government of Ontario has yet to implement mandatory vaccines. We do not have mandatory vaccines imposed by the government of Ontario. What the government of Ontario has done is said that if an employee does not get vaccinated, then they will have to undergo regular weekly COVID tests. So you would have that option. So in Ontario, there's no provincially regulated employer that can point to a government mandate and say, well, I have to let you go because that's what the government is telling me to do. That's simply not the case. That's a huge misconception. It is different, though, for federally regulated employees. The federal government has announced that for some employees regulated federally, specifically those that actually work for the federal government or those in transportation, air, marine, railway, those employees will have to be vaccinated or face consequences. That's to quote the Prime Minister. We don't know yet what those consequences are. Presumably, the idea being that if you don't get vaccinated, you will actually be let go. So to the extent that employees working for the government or for other industries that are covered by this federal mandate, those employees may face difficult situations because not only could they lose their job if they don't get vaccinated, they would be disqualified from getting any severance. They would be disqualified from getting any government benefits like EI. So that absolutely can mean financial ruin for those employees.
So sort of in the case of private businesses too, ultimately what the government says goes. If there's a mandate from the top on down, private businesses can point to that. The government themselves can also say to their employees, you have to get it because we said so.
Absolutely. So if you want to know, if you're an employee that wants to understand, can my employer mandate a vaccine on me? The first question you ask yourself is my workplace, is my employer covered by a government mandate? If the answer is yes, the employer has no choice in the matter. There's a government mandate that applies here that requires them to have me vaccinated. That employee does not have much by way of legal recourse. They have to choose whether they want to get vaccinated or risk losing their job. But if the answer is no, my employer, my workplace is not covered by a government mandate. And certainly here in Ontario, the vast majority of employers are not covered by such a mandate. If the employer decides still to implement mandatory vaccines, as I said earlier, that actually may well be illegal.
Much has been made about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. In the discourse of vaccine mandates, that document often gets invoked. But what do we know about how that would actually apply in employment and labor cases? I know we're sort of in uncharted waters here when it comes to a vaccine of this scope, if employers are considering it. But how do we know how the Charter would be applied there?
Sure. So the first thing to keep in mind is that the Charter of Rights only applies to government action. So a private business who does anything really cannot breach the Charter of Rights. They could breach human rights legislation and other legislation, but not the Charter. On the other hand, the government, by its action, for example, by imposing mandatory vaccine mandates, that may well be in breach of charter obligations and charter rights. The problem is this: you may and certainly are able to challenge government action on the basis of the charter. The problem is that a process like this, from beginning to end, can take years. If I were to say 5 years, I'm not exaggerating. So for an employee that loses their job tomorrow, engaging in a process of 5 years is not going to be particularly helpful. So as a practical matter, not a legal matter, as a practical matter, if you are covered by a government mandate that requires you to be vaccinated, your options are not going to be very attractive in terms of pursuing it by way of legal recourse. It's a long process to challenge government action on the charter. It goes through several different levels of court. The wheels of justice, when it comes to these things, don't turn particularly quickly. So employees will have to make decisions based on what's good for them in the short term, as opposed to years down the road.
As you mentioned, we could potentially see many different legal challenges and hurdles for employers who want to impose some sort of mandate. It's sort of asking you to look into the crystal ball here, but so many people heading into the fall are wondering this. Would it surprise you in the coming weeks to see more and more businesses making that mandate? Or, for the reasons that you just outlined, potentially they wouldn't do that?
I think that businesses will continue to impose mandatory vaccines. Even if they understand that there's a legal challenge, it's possible, they will say, well, we still think that the benefit of having mandatory vaccine policies outweigh whatever other liability we may have. So I think that's going to be the norm. And as time goes on and as we have more and more COVID cases, I think you will see more employers mandating these vaccines. But what I do know is that before too long, you will see some guidance from our courts on that, or human rights tribunals. Right now, the matters have not yet been decided, but I wouldn't be surprised if in the next month or two, we will have the first decision from a judge in court or from a human rights tribunal saying, yes, this is legal, or no, it isn't. Right now, we're making or giving our best advice and analysis based on how we understand the law to be. And once we do have some guidance from the courts, you may well see things change. You may see employers at that point roll back mandatory vaccines if they have a court saying that's not legal. Or you may see all employers implementing it if the courts were to say, yes, it is legal. Until then, I certainly advise employers that you have to proceed with caution, because there is definitely potential legal liability for imposing mandatory vaccines.
Lior, thank you so much for your time and for making that so clear. I know it's a little bit of legal advice potentially for our listeners. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
And that is Lior Samfiru, employment lawyer and co-founding partner of Samfiru Tumarkin LLP. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. I'm your host, Adrian Chung. Our This Matters team is me, Adrian Chung, Brian Bradley, JP Fozo, Matt Hearn, Morgan Bachnick, Raju Mudar, Saba Aitazaz, and Sean Patton. Our music is by So Called, Mike DeAngelis, and Sean Patton. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us your comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com/subscribingmatters. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.